I stood there, frozen, as my mother-in-law Vicky tied the decorative ribbons around my wrists, binding me to the wrought iron fence like some kind of party decoration. The silk cut into my skin while 30 guests watched, some gasping, most laughing. My 5-year-old son Liam screamed for me as my husband Richard held him back, doing nothing to stop his mother, Sarah, Richard's sister, tossed cake crumbs at my feet like I was a dog. That night, bound and humiliated at her birthday party, I made a silent promise. They would all pay for this. But before I tell you how I made that happen, if you're enjoying this story of standing up against toxic family members, please hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment below, telling me what you would have done in my situation. Your support means everything. Now let me take you back to where it all started. Because you need to understand how I ended up tied to a fence at my sister-in-law's birthday party. I met Richard Vance 7 years ago at a corporate mixer in downtown Chicago. It was one of those networking events where young professionals pretended to care about synergy and disruption while secretly checking out who had the best job titles. I was there representing the catering company I worked for, making sure the champagne flutes stayed full and the appetizer trays circulated. Richard was there as a junior partner at his family's investment firm, third-generation wealth. Wearing a Tom Ford suit, he approached me during a lull in the evening, loosening his tie with that practiced casual elegance that comes from growing up with money. "You look miserable," he said with a grin that was disarming in its honesty. "I'm working," I replied, adjusting my grip on the tray of shrimp cocktails. "So am I," he said. "The difference is, you're actually doing something useful. I've been listening to cryptocurrency bros pitch NFT schemes for 2 hours." He grabbed 2 champagne flutes from my tray. "Take a break with me." I shouldn't have. My supervisor was watching. But there was something magnetic about Richard Vance. He had this way of making you feel like you were the only person in the room, even surrounded by hundreds. We talked for 20 minutes about everything except work. He told me about his passion for vintage motorcycles. I told him about the business degree I was working toward at night school, taking 1 or 2 classes a semester because that's all I could afford while working 3 jobs. "You're ambitious," he said, and the way he looked at me made me feel seen in a way I hadn't experienced in years. I like that. 3 days later, flowers arrived at my apartment. Nota dozen roches, but a massive arrangement of calla lilies and orchids that must have cost $300. The card said, "Dinner no networking required." I said yes. The courtship was a whirlwind. Richard took me to restaurants where I couldn't pronounce half the menu items. He sent cars to pick me up from work. He bought me dresses for the events he took me to, claiming he wanted to spoil me. At first, I felt like Cinderella. Only later did I realize the dresses were his way of controlling how I presented myself, making sure I looked appropriate for his world. 6 months in, he proposed. We were in Napa Valley for the weekend, staying at a vineyard that cost more per night than my monthly rent. He got down on one knee at sunset with a 3-carat diamond ring that caught the light like a small star. "Marry me, Ellie," he said. "Let me take care of you. You'll never have to work multiple jobs again. You can finish school. We'll build something beautiful together." I said yes because I loved him, but also because I was exhausted. Exhausted from juggling work schedules and class schedules and trying to afford both rent and textbooks. The promise of security, of being able to focus on my education without worrying about whether I could afford groceries, was intoxicating. I should have asked myself why a man from one of Chicago's wealthiest families was moving so fast with a waitress from the South Side. But I was 24 and in love and desperate to believe in fairy tales. The first crack appeared when he took me to meet his family. The Vance estate in Lake Forest sat on 5 acres of perfectly manicured grounds. The main house was a Georgian revival mansion with 12 bedrooms, a pool house, and a tennis court. Richard's mother Vicky answered the door herself, though I later learned they had a housekeeper who usually performed that duty. Vicky wanted to size me up personally. She was tall and thin in that way that spoke of personal trainers and careful diets. Her blonde hair was cut in a sharp bob that probably required weekly salon visits to maintain. She wore white linen pants and a cashmere sweater that cost more than my car. And her smile never reached her eyes. "So you're Ellie," she said, looking me up and down like I was a piece of furniture she was considering purchasing. Richard. She's very pretty. Good bone structure. Not nice to meet you or welcome. Just an assessment of my appearance, like I was livestock at auction. Richard laughed it off, kissing his mother's cheek. Mom, be nice. Ellie's nervous enough. I'm sure she is, Vicky said, stepping aside to let us in. Come in. Dear, let's see if you can use the correct fork at dinner. I thought she was joking. She wasn't. That first dinner was an endurance test I didn't know I was taking. The dining room could seat 20. But it was just the four of us, Richard, Vicky, Richard's sister Sarah, and me. The table was set with more silverware than I'd ever seen at one place setting. Vicky watched every move I made, a slight smile playing at her lips whenever I hesitated over which utensil to use. Sarah, who was 19 at the time, barely acknowledged me. She spent most of dinner on her phone, occasionally making comments about her spring break plans in Cabo. When Vicky asked me about my background, I made the mistake of being honest. I told them about growing up in Bridgeport, about my dad who worked construction until his back gave out, about my mom who cleaned houses to make ends meet. How industrious. Vicky said in a tone that made the word sound like an insult. Richard, you've always had a soft spot for charity cases. Mom, Richard said, but there was no real force behind it. Just a weak protest that died quickly. I'm not a charity case, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I'm putting myself through college while working full-time. Of course you are, dear, Vicky said, cutting into her duck with precise movements. And now you won't have to do that anymore. Will you? How fortunate for you that Richard came along. The implication hung in the air. I was a gold digger who'd trapped her son. I looked at Richard, expecting him to defend me, to tell his mother that he'd pursued me, that he'd proposed. Instead, he changed the subject, asking Sarah about her classes at Northwestern. The message was clear. In the Vance family, Vicky's opinion was law, and contradicting her wasn't worth the trouble. I should have walked away that night. I should have given the ring back and returned to my life of multiple jobs and night classes. But I didn't, because Richard was attentive and apologetic afterward. He told me his mother just needed time to adjust, that she'd eventually see how amazing I was. He promised things would get better after the wedding. I believed him because I wanted to, because I'd already started imagining a life where I didn't have to choose between paying rent and buying textbooks. The wedding was set for 8 months later. Richard wanted a small ceremony, just close family and friends. Vicky had other ideas. Within 2 weeks of the engagement announcement, she'd taken over all planning, insisting that a Vance wedding required a certain level of elegance. The guest list ballooned from 50 to 300. The venue changed from the botanical gardens I'd loved to the country club where Vicky was on the board. Every decision I tried to make was overruled. I wanted wildflowers for the centerpieces because they reminded me of summers at my grandmother's farm. Vicky changed them to white roses and orchids because wildflowers were too casual for a Vance event. I wanted my cousin Marissa as maid of honor. Vicky suggested it would be more appropriate if Sarah took that role since we were becoming sisters. Richard agreed with his mother. The seating chart for the reception was the final insult. My family, all 20 people who'd managed to afford the trip to Lake Forest, were seated in the back near the kitchen doors. Meanwhile, Vicky's garden club friends had prime spots near the head table. When I objected, Vicky explained that the front tables were reserved for important guests who'd contributed to the family's business and social standing. My father, who'd worked 2 jobs his entire life to raise 3 kids, wasn't important enough to sit near the front at his own daughter's wedding. It's just one day, Richard said when I came to him in tears. Let Mom have this. It means a lot to her to show you off to her friends. Show me off, I said. Your mother has me and my family hidden in the back like we're something to be ashamed of. You're being too sensitive, Richard said. And I heard that phrase so many times over the next 7 years that it became like white noise. My family has certain expectations. Once we're married and settled, none of this will matter. But it did matter. Every small concession I made, every time I swallowed my pride and accepted Vicky's changes, I was setting a precedent. I was teaching them that I could be pushed around, that my opinions and feelings were less important than maintaining the Vance family image. I was building my own cage, brick by brick. The wedding day itself was beautiful in an impersonal way. The country club was decorated like something from a magazine spread. I wore the dress Vicky had chosen, not the simpler one I'd fallen in love with. I walked down an aisle lined with white roses that cost more than my parents' mortgage payment, toward a man I loved, but was beginning not to recognize. During the ceremony, when Richard slipped the ring on my finger, I saw Vicky in the front row, not crying or smiling, just watching with a satisfied expression like she'd just closed a particularly good business deal. The reception was a blur of faces I didn't know, people congratulating me while their eyes assessed every detail of the event. My family looked uncomfortable in their dress clothes, crowded at their tables in the back, trying to make the best of it. My mother kept catching my eye and smiling, but I could see the worry there. She'd tried to warn me, in her gentle way, that marrying into a family like the Vances might not be the fairy tale I was imagining. I dismissed her concerns as outdated thinking. Now, watching her sit at a back table while Vicky held court at the front, I wondered if she'd been right. The honeymoon was 2 weeks in Bali, staying at a resort where the villas had private pools and butlers. It should have been paradise. Richard was attentive and loving, the man I'd fallen for during those early dates. But even there, Vicky's influence followed us. Richard called her every day, updating her on our activities, asking her opinion on decisions that should have been ours alone to make. When I suggested we extend the trip by a few days, Richard said we couldn't because his mother had already planned a welcome home dinner and had invited important clients. Can't we just skip it? I asked. Tell her we want some time to ourselves. You don't say no to my mother. Richard said, like this was an obvious fact of life. She's done so much for us. The least we can do is show up when she asks. That became the pattern. Vicky would summon us for family dinners, social events, holiday gatherings, and Richard would immediately rearrange our schedules to accommodate her. If I had plans, they were canceled. If I objected, I was being difficult or ungrateful. Slowly, imperceptibly, my life stopped being mine. It became an extension of Vicky's expectations and Richard's unwillingness to contradict his mother. 2 months after the wedding, I found out I was pregnant. I was terrified and thrilled in equal measure. I'd planned to wait a few years, to finish my degree and maybe start a career before having kids. But accidents happen, and once I saw those 2 lines on the pregnancy test, I fell in love with the idea of being a mother. Richard was excited in his careful, controlled way. His first call was to his mother. Vicky arrived at our condo within the hour. She swept in with shopping bags from Nordstrom, full of baby magazines and maternity vitamins. Darling, this is wonderful news, she said, kissing Richard's cheek. Then she turned to me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I suppose we should be grateful you waited until after the wedding. The implication that I might have gotten pregnant to trap Richard hung in the air. I opened my mouth to object, but Richard was already thanking his mother for coming over, for being so supportive. He didn't see the insult, or he chose not to. I was learning that he was very good at not seeing things that would require him to stand up to his mother. Now, Ellie, Vicky said, settling onto our couch like she owned it. We need to discuss your plans. Obviously, you'll quit those little jobs of yours. A Vance baby deserves a mother who's home full-time. I was planning to finish my degree, I said carefully. I'm only 6 classes away from graduating. Classes, Vicky laughed. Dear, you're going to be a mother. What do you need a degree for? Richard provides beautifully, unless you're saying his income isn't sufficient. She'd neatly backed me into a corner. If I insisted on finishing school, I was implying Richard couldn't support us. If I gave up my education, I was admitting she was right. I looked at Richard, hoping he'd tell his mother that my education was important, that we'd figure out a way to balance school and the baby. Instead, he looked uncomfortable and said nothing. Let's just table the discussion, I said, my hands unconsciously moving to my still flat stomach. I have 7 months before the baby comes. We don't need to decide everything today. But Vicky had already decided, and her decisions had a way of becoming reality in the Vance family. Within a week, Richard had convinced me that staying home would be better for the baby. He pointed out that childcare in Chicago was expensive, that my school schedule would be difficult to manage with a newborn. that his salary was more than enough for us to live comfortably. Every argument was reasonable on the surface, but underneath was the real message. Vicky wanted me home and dependent, and Richard would make sure that happened. I gave up my jobs first, then my classes. It felt like relief at first, not having to juggle multiple schedules, not falling asleep over textbooks at midnight. But as the weeks passed and my belly grew, I began to feel the walls closing in. My friends from school stopped calling as much. My coworkers sent a nice baby gift and then faded from my life. My world shrank to doctor's appointments, baby registries, and an increasing number of visits from Vicky, who had opinions on everything from my choice of crib to the color I'd painted the nursery. Liam was born on a cold February morning after 18 hours of labor. He was perfect. 7 pounds 3 ounces with a full head of dark hair and lungs that could wake the dead. I'd never felt love like that before. Immediate and consuming and terrifying in its intensity. When they placed him in my arms, I made a silent promise that I would give him everything I could, that I would be the mother he deserved. Richard was a proud father, taking photos and calling everyone he knew. Vicky showed up at the hospital with an enormous flower arrangement and a list of parenting advice that made it clear she thought I was unprepared for motherhood. "Newborns are so fragile," she said, barely glancing at Liam, before launching into a lecture about proper bathing techniques and feeding schedules. "I hope you've been reading the books I sent you." I had been reading them, all 12 of them, trying to prepare myself for the overwhelming responsibility of keeping a tiny human alive. But Vicky's tone suggested she doubted my competence, and in my exhausted, hormone-flooded state, I felt tears pricking at my eyes. My mother, who'd flown in from Chicago to help, put a protective hand on my shoulder. "Ellie's going to be a wonderful mother," my mom said firmly. "She's smart and capable and full of love." Vicky gave my mother a look that could freeze water. "Of course she is. I'm simply offering guidance from someone who's raised children successfully." The unspoken comparison hung in the air. Vicky had raised Richard and Sarah with money and privilege, while my mother had raised 3 kids in a cramped bungalow on the south side. Vicky's way was clearly superior. Or so the implication went. The first few months of Liam's life were a blur of sleepless nights and constant feeding and the sharp learning curve of new parenthood. My mother stayed for 2 weeks, helping with everything and running interference with Vicky, who called daily with advice and criticism. After my mother left, I felt the isolation settle in like a heavy blanket. Richard went back to work at his mother's investment firm, leaving early and coming home late. Vicky visited often, always finding something to criticize. The way I dressed Liam, the brand of diapers I used, the fact that I looked tired. "You really should make more of an effort with your appearance," Vicky said one afternoon, finding me in sweatpants and a milk-stained t-shirt. "Richard works very hard. The least you can do is look presentable when he comes home." I was operating on 3 hours of sleep, covered in spit up, and she was criticizing my appearance. I wanted to scream at her, to tell her that taking care of a newborn was harder than anything she'd ever done because she'd had nannies and housekeepers to do the actual work. But I didn't, because making waves in the Vance family had consequences, and I was beginning to understand that my position was precarious. As Liam grew, the financial control tightened. Richard put me on an allowance, depositing a set amount into a checking account each month for household expenses. When I asked why I couldn't have access to our joint accounts, he explained that this was how his family managed money, that it was more organized this way. The allowance was generous enough to cover groceries and baby supplies, but it meant I had to ask permission for anything extra. New clothes for myself, a haircut, coffee with an old friend. Meanwhile, Sarah was living off the family money without any restrictions. She dropped out of Northwestern after 2 years, claiming college wasn't for her, and was now pursuing a career as an influencer. This apparently involved expensive shopping trips, international vacations, and a new Mercedes that Vicky bought her for her 21st birthday. When I mentioned the disparity to Richard, he told me I was being jealous. "Sarah's young," he said. "She's figuring things out. You're a mother now. You don't need designer handbags and trips to Europe." But Sarah did. The double standard was glaring, but pointing it out made me look petty and ungrateful. I was learning that in the Vance family, fairness wasn't a consideration. There were the real family members, and then there was me. The outsider who should be grateful for whatever scraps they threw my way. The family gatherings were the worst. Every holiday, every birthday, every anniversary was an opportunity for me to be reminded of my place. At Thanksgiving, while Sarah lounged in the living room posting selfies, I was expected to help in the kitchen. Not help Vicky cook, because she hired caterers, but to serve and clean and make sure everything ran smoothly. At Christmas, I wrapped presents for everyone while 8 months pregnant with my second child. Oh yes, he got pregnant again. This time after Richard and I had an argument about money, and he'd been particularly attentive for a few days. The pregnancy test was positive 2 weeks later, and I knew immediately that I was trapped even more completely than before. But that second pregnancy ended at 10 weeks. I woke up one morning with cramping and bleeding, and by the time Richard got me to the hospital, it was over. The doctor said these things happen, that it was nobody's fault, but I felt like I'd failed. Richard was kind but distant, uncomfortable with emotional displays. Vicky sent flowers with a card that said, "Better luck next time." Like I'd failed a test rather than lost a child. I grieved alone. In the quiet hours when Liam napped, allowing myself to cry for the baby I'd never meet and for the life I'd given up to be here. My friends from before my marriage had moved on with their careers and lives. I had no one to talk to who would understand. Richard thought I should just move on, that dwelling on the miscarriage wasn't healthy. Vicky suggested trying again soon. Because Liam needed a sibling, nobody asked what I wanted. Nobody considered that maybe I needed time to heal, physically and emotionally. I was a vessel for producing Vance heirs, a housekeeper to maintain their homes, and a servant to make their gatherings run smoothly. I wasn't a person with my own needs and dreams. I'd become exactly what Vicky had intended from the start, controllable and dependent. The breaking point started building a year before Sarah's 25th birthday party, though I didn't recognize it at the time. Richard came home one evening looking stressed, pouring himself a drink before dinner, which was unusual for him. When I asked what was wrong, he brushed me off. But the stress didn't go away. He became short-tempered with me, dismissive of Liam, and spent more and more time at the office or on phone calls with his mother. I started paying attention, something I'd stopped doing years ago, because being aware just made the pain sharper. I noticed that Richard always closed his laptop when I entered the room. I noticed that he'd changed all his passwords, something he'd never bothered with before, because he'd always said he had nothing to hide. I noticed that Vicky seemed anxious too, snapping at service staff and drinking more wine than usual at family dinners. Something was wrong, and they were keeping it from me, which meant it was probably something that would affect my life. I'd learned that the Vances only kept secrets when they were doing something they knew was wrong or when they were about to make a decision for me without my input. Usually both. One afternoon, while Richard was at work and Liam was at a play date, I went into Richard's home office. He'd forbidden me from entering it years ago, claiming he needed space that was just his. And I'd respected that boundary because I was still trying to be the good wife who didn't make waves. But fear was finally stronger than compliance. The office was obsessively organized, everything filed and labeled with the precision of someone who deals in money. I started with the desk drawers, not really knowing what I was looking for, just knowing I needed to understand what had Richard so stressed. In the bottom drawer, under a stack of old investment reports, I found a folder labeled Confidential Business Matters. Inside were bank statements for accounts I'd never heard of, spreadsheets tracking investments with returns that seemed impossibly high, emails discussing fund transfers and investor relations that used language I half remembered from my abandoned business degree. I took photos of everything with my phone, my hands shaking. I'm not sure what I was looking at, but knowing it was important. That night, after Richard came home and we went through the motions of dinner and bedtime routine, I stayed up late researching. I looked up the terms from the documents, cross-referenced the account numbers with public records, traced the connections between Richard's investment firm and Vicky's charitable foundation. What I discovered made my blood run cold. Richard's firm was running a classic Ponzi scheme. They were using new investors' money to pay returns to existing investors, creating the illusion of profitable investments while slowly draining the fund. The scheme had been going on for at least 3 years, which meant it had started shortly after we got married. I thought about all the fancy dinners, the luxury cars, the renovation Vicky had done on the estate last year. all of it paid for with stolen money. But it got worse. Vicky's charitable foundation, which claimed to support children's hospitals and cancer research, was mostly a front. They took in donations, issued tax receipts, and then funneled most of the money into offshore accounts or back into Richard's firm to keep the Ponzi scheme running. The charity work they did do was minimal, just enough to maintain appearances. I sat in the dark living room, my laptop screen casting blue light on my face, and felt something shift inside me. For 7 years, I'd told myself that the Vances were better than me, more educated, more sophisticated, more deserving of respect. They'd made me feel small and worthless and grateful for any crumbs of approval they threw my way. But they weren't better. They were criminals. They were thieves stealing from people who trusted them, ruining lives to maintain their lavish lifestyle. And I had evidence, photographs of documents, email chains, bank statements. I'd spent 7 years being invisible in this family, dismissed as too stupid or too unsophisticated to understand their business. They'd underestimated me catastrophically. I should have gone to Richard, confronted him, demanded an explanation. Maybe a smarter person would have consulted a lawyer first, but I was still in shock, still processing the scope of the fraud. I closed my laptop and sat in the dark, thinking about my son sleeping upstairs, thinking about all the people whose retirement savings Richard had stolen, thinking about how Vicky had made me feel worthless while she was nothing but a common thief. The next morning, Richard was cheerful over breakfast, like the stress of recent weeks had evaporated. "Mom's planning Sarah's birthday party," he said, scrolling through his phone. "It's going to be a big one. 25th birthday. You know, she wants you to help with setup." Of course she did, because I was the help, the unpaid servant who existed to make their events run smoothly. "Sure," I said, feeding Liam his cereal. "Whatever she needs." Richard looked at me suspiciously, like my easy agreement was a trap. "You're being very accommodating." "I'm always accommodating," I said. "It's what I do." He seemed satisfied with that answer and went back to his phone. I watched him, this man I'd loved and married, and had a child with, and felt nothing but cold contempt. He was a thief and a fraud, and he'd turned me into an accomplice by keeping me dependent and isolated. Well, not anymore. The weeks leading up to Sarah's party were surreal. I played my role perfectly. The dutiful daughter-in-law and sister-in-law, helping Vicky plan every detail of the elaborate celebration. I nodded when she criticized my suggestions. I smiled when she handed me lists of chores. I watched Sarah try on expensive dresses for the party, while I wore the same 3 outfits on rotation because my allowance didn't stretch to new clothes. But at night, after everyone was asleep, I continued my research. I created a timeline of the fraud, matched deposits to investor names, documented every illegal transaction I could find evidence of. I was methodical and thorough, approaching it like the business analysis I'd learned about in those college classes I'd had to abandon. Turned out I was pretty good at it. I also started making calls. Anonymous calls to the Securities and Exchange Commission, providing just enough information to pique their interest without revealing my identity. I sent carefully worded emails to the Illinois Attorney General's office about Vicky's foundation. I reached out to some of the investors whose names I'd found in Richard's files, creating a fake email account to tip them off that they might want to request a detailed accounting of their investments. I was lighting fires all around the Vance empire. Small ones at first. Just enough smoke to make people start asking questions. I knew the investigation would take time, that these things moved slowly. But I could be patient. I'd been patient for 7 years. A few more weeks were nothing. The night of Sarah's 25th birthday party arrived. The estate was transformed into something out of a fairy tale. If fairy tales featured champagne fountains and ice sculptures that cost more than most people's cars, twinkling lights hung from every tree. A string quartet played near the pool. White roses covered every available surface, their sickly sweet scent heavy in the evening air. I arrived with Liam, both of us dressed modestly compared to the designer-clad guests. I'd spent hours setting up tables and arranging flowers, my back aching from the work. Liam was excited about the party, talking nonstop about the cake he'd seen delivered earlier. It was a massive 3-tier creation covered in fondant flowers and gold leaf, a monument to excess. My role, as always, was to fade into the background. Keep the drinks flowing. Make sure the appetizers circulated. Don't draw attention to myself. Be grateful I was allowed to be there at all. For 7 years, I'd played this part, and I'd gotten very good at it. Tonight would be no different. At least, that's what they thought. The party was in full swing when Sarah spotted me near the drink station. She was wearing a dress that probably cost $5,000. Her hair and makeup professionally done. A champagne flute in her hand that was certainly not her first of the evening. She looked at me with that particular blend of contempt and amusement she'd perfected over the years. "Hey, Ellie," she called out, loud enough to cut through the nearby conversations. "You think you can just freeload at my party, make yourself useful?" I felt every eye turn toward us. The music continued, but the chatter died down as people sensed drama about to unfold. Sarah grabbed a cloth napkin from the table and threw it at my face. It hit me square in the nose, and laughter rippled through the crowd. Not uncomfortable laughter, but genuine amusement. Like watching the help get put in their place was quality entertainment. I bent to pick up the napkin, my cheeks burning with familiar humiliation. This was nothing new. Public degradation was just another Tuesday in the Vance family. But tonight felt different because I knew something they didn't. I knew their empire was already crumbling, that federal investigators were already building cases, that their victims were already consulting lawyers. This party, this show of wealth and power, was a final gasp before everything came crashing down. But they didn't know that yet, and I wasn't ready to reveal my hand. So I played my part, bending to pick up the napkin, swallowing my rage, because timing was everything. That's when Liam tugged on my sleeve. "Mommy, can I have a piece of cake?" My sweet boy, who'd been so patient all evening, who'd watched other kids eating expensive appetizers while I told him to wait, who just wanted a small piece of the enormous cake that had 3 tiers and could easily feed 100 people. His request was reasonable. His voice was hopeful. He was 5 years old and hungry and asking his mother for cake at a birthday party. "Of course, baby," I started to say, already moving toward the cake table. "Don't you dare touch that cake." Vicky's voice cut across the patio like a whip crack. She materialized from the crowd, champagne sloshing in her glass, her face flushed with alcohol and anger. The music actually stopped this time. Every single person at the party was watching now. This tableau of family drama unfolding on Sarah's birthday. "That cake is for actual family and guests," Vicky continued, her voice sharp and cruel. "Not for you and your consequence." She pointed at Liam with such venom that my son pressed himself against my legs, his small body trembling. The world seemed to slow down. I heard someone gasp. I saw Richard emerging from a group of his work colleagues, his face uncertain. I saw Sarah with her phone out, probably filming this for her Instagram story. I saw 30 wealthy people watching a grandmother call a 5-year-old child a consequence, and not one of them moved to intervene. "He's 5 years old." "Vicky," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I felt. "It's just a piece of cake." I said no. Vicky's face had gone from flush to crimson. "You don't get to tell me what to do in my house at my daughter's party. You're nothing but a gold digger who trapped my son. And that boy is living proof." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the string quartet had stopped playing. Liam started crying. Kiet. Hitching sobs that broke my heart. I looked at Richard. I willing him to defend his son. To defend us. He opened his mouth, closed it, looked away. "Coward." "Richard," I said. And there was a question in that single word. "This is your son. This is your wife. Are you really going to let your mother talk about us like this?" "Ellie, let's not make a scene," Richard said, and his voice was weak, placating. "Mom's had a lot to drink. This isn't the time or place. There's never a time or place to stand up to your mother." "Is there?" I said. And something in my voice must have registered, because Richard actually looked worried. 7 years. Richard. 7 years I've put up with being treated like garbage by your family. I've smiled through the insults. I've worked like a servant at every one of your events. I've accepted being put on an allowance like a child. I've watched your sister get everything while I get scraps. And now your mother just called our son a consequence. And you're telling me not to make a scene. You're being hysterical. Vicky said. Someone needs to teach you your place. That's when Sarah laughed. Actually laughed. Oh my God. This is the best birthday present ever. Ellie finally showing her trailer trash roots. She turned to the crowd. Anyone recording this? This is going on TikTok. And that's when I snapped. Not in the way they expected. Not with tears or shouting or running away. I snapped into perfect clarity. These people were going to regret this moment for the rest of their lives, and I was going to make absolutely certain of it. You know what I said? My voice calm and cold. You want me to know my place. Let's make it crystal clear. Richard looked panicked now. Ellie, don't. But Sarah was already moving forward, gesturing to Richard. Oh, this is perfect. Come on, big brother. Let's show the gold digger what happens when you forget your place. And that's how I ended up tied to the wrought iron fence with decorative ribbons, in front of 30 witnesses, while my husband held me still and my mother-in-law tied the knots, the silk cut into my wrists. My son screamed for me, and Sarah, drunk on champagne and cruelty, tossed cake crumbs at my feet like I was a dog. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I looked at each of them in turn, memorizing their faces. This moment, this final humiliation, and I made myself a promise. They would all pay for this. Every single one of them. The party continued around me. People actually went back to eating and drinking and socializing while I stood tied to a fence. Some looked uncomfortable. Some whispered and pointed. Some filmed it on their phones. Sarah walked by twice, each time tossing more cake crumbs at my feet, laughing each time. Liam cried himself sick. And eventually someone, I don't even know who, took him inside. An hour passed. Then another. My legs ached. My wrists burned where the ribbons cut into my skin. I stared straight ahead. Not at the party, but at some point in the distance. And I plotted, finally. As the party was winding down and guests were leaving, Richard came to untie me. His fingers fumbled with the knots, made tight by Vicky's vicious efficiency. Sorry, he mumbled. You know how Mom gets. She didn't mean it. I said nothing. I didn't trust myself to speak without screaming. Come on. Ellie, don't be like this. It was just a joke that went too far. A joke. Tying someone to a fence and humiliating them in front of dozens of people was a joke. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw a weak man who'd always choose his mother over his wife, who'd watch his son be degraded and do nothing to stop it. I saw a criminal who stole from hardworking people to maintain a lifestyle he hadn't earned. I saw someone who'd trapped me in a marriage built on lies and control. Where's Liam? I asked. Inside with the nanny. He's fine. He fell asleep. I nodded and walked away without another word. I found my son on a couch in the library, his face blotchy from crying, thumb in his mouth, even though he'd stopped that habit months ago. I scooped him up gently, and he curled against me without waking. I walked out of that house with my son in my arms, got in my car, and drove away. In the rearview mirror, I saw the Vance estate lit up like a beacon. This monument to wealth and privilege and cruelty. I didn't cry. Crying was for people who still had hope that things would get better. I was past hope. I was moving on to action. That night, after putting Liam to bed and spending 20 minutes rubbing antibacterial ointment on my raw wrists, I sat down at my laptop. I accessed the email account I'd created weeks ago and sent carefully compiled packages to 3 different addresses. The SEC got a comprehensive breakdown of Richard's Ponzi scheme, complete with account numbers, investor names, and transaction records spanning 3 years. The Attorney General's office got evidence of Vicky's charity fraud, showing exactly how donation money was being funneled into private accounts. And I sent a special package to the medical board about Marcus Thorne, Sarah fiancé, whose forged medical credentials I'd discovered while digging into the family's business dealings. Turned out, Marcus had bought his degree from a Caribbean diploma mill and had been practicing medicine illegally for 2 years. Then I started making calls. I contacted every investor whose name appeared in Richard's files, giving them anonymous tips to request detailed accountings of their investments. I reached out to local journalists who covered financial crimes, dropping hints about a major Ponzi scheme in Lake Forest. I methodically lit every fire I'd been planning, watching from a safe distance, as the first wisps of smoke began to rise. I also called a divorce attorney, something I should have done years ago. I made an appointment for the next day. Then I opened a bank account in my own name at a different bank. One the Vances had no connection to. I had almost no money to put in it, but it was mine. And that mattered more than the amount. Richard came home around 2 in the morning, smelling like expensive whiskey and looking haggard. He found me sitting in the living room, my laptop still open, my wrists wrapped in bandages. "We need to talk," he said. "Do we?" I asked, my voice flat. "Look, I'm sorry about tonight. Mom went too far. Sarah went too far. It shouldn't have happened. But it did happen," I said. "And you let it happen. You held me still while your mother tied me to a fence. Richard, your mother called our son a consequence, and you didn't say a word to defend him. So I don't think we need to talk. I think we're past talking." He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture of frustration I'd seen 1,000 times. "What do you want me to say? That my family's difficult. I've always told you that. But they're family. You don't just walk away from family." "Don't you?" I said. "Because I'm your family too. Liam is your family. But we don't seem to matter as much as Vicky and Sarah." "You're being unreasonable," Richard said. And there it was again. That phrase designed to make me doubt my own reality. "You knew what you were getting into when you married me." "Did I?" I stood up, closing my laptop with deliberate calm. "Because I thought I was marrying a man who would protect me and our child. Instead, I married a coward who lets his mother run his life and treats his wife like an employee." "Sonu." "Richard." I don't think I knew what I was getting into at all. I walked past him, heading for the stairs and the guest bedroom where I'd be sleeping from now on. He grabbed my arm. Not hard, but enough to stop me. "Where do you think you're going?" he asked. "To bed," I said. "Alone. That's where I'll be sleeping from now on until I figure out my next move." "Your next move?" He looked genuinely confused. "What does that mean?" "It means I'm done. Richard. I'm done being the family punching bag. I'm done raising our son in an environment where his own grandmother calls him a consequence. I'm done pretending that any of this is okay." I pulled my arm free and went upstairs, leaving him standing in the living room looking lost. I didn't know if he understood yet that I was serious. I didn't particularly care. The gears were already in motion, and soon, the Vance family would have much bigger problems than their daughter-in-law finally growing a spine. The next morning, I met with the divorce attorney, a woman named Patricia Chen, who came highly recommended for handling high-net-worth divorces. I told her everything, showed her the photos I'd taken of Richard's documents, explained the financial control and emotional abuse I'd endured for 7 years. She listened with the focused intensity of someone who'd heard variations of this story many times before. "You have grounds for divorce," Patricia said. "The financial control alone constitutes economic abuse, and given what you've discovered about his business practices, we can make a strong case for full custody of your son and substantial spousal support." "I don't want his money," I said. "I just want out. I want to protect Liam." Patricia looked at me over her reading glasses. "Mrs. Vance, you gave up your education and career to raise your child. You're entitled to support while you rebuild your life. Don't let them make you feel guilty for taking what you've earned." I hadn't thought of it that way. 7 years of free labor, of organizing their events and maintaining their home and raising their grandchild, while being paid an allowance like a teenager. When you added it up, I'd earned far more than any settlement would give me. "Okay," I said. "Whatever you think is fair." "Good," Patricia said. "Now, about these documents you photographed. I need to advise you that I've already reported it to the SEC. I interrupted. "And the Attorney General's office. Anonymous tips. Intraseable." Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she smiled. A small, fierce expression. "Good for you. Though I'll pretend I didn't hear that. Do you have somewhere safe to stay once you file for divorce? Things might get ugly." "I'll find somewhere," I said, though I had no idea where. My family lived in a cramped house with barely enough room for themselves. I had no friends left after 7 years of isolation. But I'd figure it out. I always did. As it turned out, I didn't have to figure it out immediately. because 3 days later, everything exploded. I was making breakfast for Liam when my phone started ringing. It was Vicky, her voice shaking with rage and panic. "What did you do?" she screamed. "What the hell did you do?" "Good morning, Vicky," I said calmly, putting the phone on speaker so I could continue making Liam's oatmeal. "I have no idea what you're talking about. The SEC is at Richard's office. They're seizing documents, they're freezing accounts, someone sent them evidence. Detailed evidence about every transaction for the past 3 years. It was you. Wasn't it? It had to be you." "Why would you assume it was me?" I asked. "Unless you're admitting there's something criminal to find." Vicky made a strangled sound. "Don't play games with me. You little bitch, you've destroyed us. Richard could go to prison, our family's reputation is ruined, all because you couldn't handle a little teasing at a party." "A little teasing," I repeated, and my voice dropped to something cold and dangerous. "You tied me to a fence. Vicky, you called my son a consequence. You've spent 7 years making me feel worthless, so if the SEC has evidence of crimes, maybe you should be asking yourself who committed those crimes in the first place. We gave you everything." Vicky was crying now, actual tear distorting her voice. "A home, a name, security, and this is how you repay us. You gave me nothing but misery." I said, "You made me earn every scrap of basic human dignity. You used me as free labor and emotional punching bag. And now you're facing consequences for your own actions. And you want to blame me. I don't belong to your family. Remember, you told me that yourself. So whatever's happening to you has nothing to do with me." I hung up. My hands were shaking, but it was the good kind of shaking. The adrenaline of finally standing up for myself. Liam looked up from his coloring book. "Who was that?" "Mommy?" he asked. "Nobody important." "Baby," I said. "Eat your breakfast." The news broke that afternoon. Local media picked up the story. Prominent Lake Forest investment firm under federal investigation for fraud. By evening, it was trending on Chicago Twitter. Someone had leaked details about the Ponzi scheme, about the millions of dollars stolen from retirees and small investors. Richard's face was all over the news. The handsome facade now associated with crime and betrayal. The charity fraud came out the next day. And with it, Vicky's name. The foundation that claimed to support sick children had actually funneled hundreds of thousands of dollars into offshore accounts. The small amount that actually went to charity was just enough to maintain their tax-exempt status and public image. Donors were outraged. Social media erupted. Someone dug up photos from Sarah's birthday party, including several showing me tied to the fence. The optics were devastating. Wealthy family steals from the vulnerable, while literally binding their daughter-in-law like a servant. Then Marcus's fake credentials came to light, and Sarah's world imploded. The hospital where Marcus worked launched an investigation. His patient outcomes were suspiciously poor. There was talk of malpractice suits. Sarah, who'd been documenting her fabulous life with her surgeon fiancé all over Instagram, suddenly deleted all her social media. Marcus fled the state before authorities could arrest him, leaving Sarah to deal with the fallout alone. The calls and messages started pouring in, but I'd blocked all their numbers. I watched the news coverage from a cheap hotel room I'd rented with what little money I had. Liam playing with his toys on the bed, both of us safe from the chaos I'd unleashed. I felt no guilt. These were consequences they'd earned through their own actions. I'd simply made sure those actions came to light. Richard tried to come to the hotel, but I'd registered under a fake name. He tried to access our joint bank account to pay his legal fees, only to discover that Vicky had already drained it to pay her own lawyers. The Vance family was turning on each other, exactly as I'd known they would when the pressure mounted. There was no loyalty there. No real love. Just a house of cards built on stolen money and mutual selfishness. And I'd been the wind that finally blew it down. A week after the investigation broke, Vicky showed up at the diner where I'd started working. I'd taken a job as a waitress again, coming full circle to where I'd been when I met Richard. But this time it felt different. This time I was choosing it. Building towards something better. On my own terms. Vicky looked like she'd aged 10 years in 10 days. Her designer clothes hung loose on her frame. Her hair was unwashed. Her makeup was smeared, like she'd been crying. She stormed into the diner during lunch rush, ignoring the hostess, searching the room until she found me. "You destroyed us," she screamed. and the entire restaurant went silent. Everything we built, our family's legacy gone because of you. My manager Carla started to intervene. But I held up a hand. I finished taking an order from a table, smiled at the customers, and then walked over to Vicky with complete calm. Your family's legacy, I said quietly. You mean the legacy of fraud and theft? Of stealing from people who trusted you? Of treating anyone you considered beneath you like garbage? We were good to you, Vicky insisted. We gave you a life you never could have had. You tied me to a fence, I said, and my voice carried across the silent diner. You called my son a consequence. You made me beg for grocery money while your daughter bought designer handbags. You used me as free labor for 7 years. So no? Vicky, you weren't good to me. You were cruel. And now you're facing the consequences of your own actions. Vicky lunged forward and swept a tray of dishes off a nearby table. They shattered on the floor, and Carla immediately grabbed the phone to call the police. Richard will take your son. He'll make sure you never see that kid again. We'll destroy you in court. Richard is facing 10 to 15 years for fraud. I said, his assets are frozen. His reputation is destroyed. And I have 7 years of documentation about how your family treated me. So no, Vicky. I don't think Richard will be taking anyone anywhere. But you're welcome to try. The police arrived and escorted Vicky out. She was still screaming threats. But they sounded hollow now. The desperate rage of someone who'd finally realized they had no power left. I swept up the broken dishes, apologized to the customers, and went back to work. That night, I drove past the Vance estate one more time. I'd been doing this every few days, watching the slow deterioration of their empire. The foreclosure notice had been joined by others. The grounds, once immaculate, were overgrown. The fountain was dry. Lights were on in only a few rooms. The house that had once seemed like a castle now looked like what it really was, an empty monument to greed and cruelty. I felt nothing looking at it. No triumph. No satisfaction. No vindication. Just a kind of peaceful emptiness. This place had no hold over me anymore. These people had no power over me. I'd been tied to their fence. Literally and metaphorically. But I'd cut myself free. And now, they were the ones trapped by the consequences of their own actions. But I wasn't quite finished. There was one more thing I needed to do. One final act to close this chapter completely. Sarah's birthday was coming up again. A year to the day since I'd been tied to that fence. I heard through my divorce attorney that the Vances were planning a small gathering, a desperate attempt to maintain some normalcy while their legal troubles mounted. Richard was out on bail. His trial scheduled for 6 months later. Vicky was facing arraignment next month. But they were going to celebrate Sarah's birthday anyway. Because image was everything to these people, I decided I needed to be there. Not for revenge. Not for confrontation. But for closure. I needed to look them in the eye one more time and know that I was truly free. I needed to finish what that night had started. I dressed Liam in his nicest clothes and drove to the estate on the evening of Sarah's birthday. The party was nothing like last year's extravaganza. There were maybe 15 people scattered around the patio, where a year ago there had been hundreds. The decorations looked cheap, probably from Party City instead of a high-end event planner. The cake was a single tier from a grocery store, not the elaborate creation they'd had before. I walked in with Liam holding my hand, and conversations stopped. Richard saw me first, his face draining of color. He looked terrible, gray and haggard. Like the stress of the investigation was eating him alive. Sarah stood near the cake table, wearing a dress that was nice but not designer. Her face puffy like she'd been crying. Vicky sat in a chair looking diminished. Nothing like the imperious matriarch who'd once ruled this family with an iron fist. Ellie, Richard said, his voice hoarse. What are you doing here? I brought a gift for Sarah, I said pleasantly, walking to the cake table. I set down a large manila envelope next to the sad little birthday cake. I thought she'd want to see it. Richard moved toward me, his hand reaching for the envelope. But I stepped back. Open it, I suggested. I think everyone should see. His hands shook as he opened the envelope. Inside were copies of documents I'd saved for this exact moment, loan agreements with forged signatures, property deeds that had been fraudulently used as collateral. Even more evidence of the family's financial crimes that I discovered in my deep dive through Richard's files. These were copies. Of course, the originals had gone to the authorities weeks ago. Adding to the already damning case against the Vances, these are copies, I said conversationally. As Richard's face went from gray to white, the originals went to the district attorney last week. They show the full extent of the loan fraud you and your mother committed. The bank's lawyers should be arriving with foreclosure proceedings any day now. I thought you'd want to see them first. Why? Richard whispered. Why are you doing this to us? I'm not doing anything to you. I said. You did this to yourselves. You committed fraud. You stole from people. You built your entire life on lies and other people's money. I'm simply making sure everyone knows the truth. Vicky stood up, her face contorted with rage and desperation. You vengeful little bitch, you've destroyed everything, our family, our reputation, our lives, all because you couldn't handle being put in your place. My place, I repeated. And I felt something cold and powerful settle in my chest. You tied me to a fence a year ago. Right here. At this very party, you called my son a consequence. You spent 7 years treating me like garbage. And you thought I would just take it forever. We gave you everything, Sarah screamed, finally finding her voice. You were nothing before Richard A. Waitress with no future. We gave you a life. You gave me hell. I said simply. You used me. You controlled me. You made me feel worthless every single day. But I remembered everything. Every password Richard left on sticky notes. Every careless document he left in his desk. Every conversation you had when you thought I wasn't listening or was too stupid to understand. You treated me like I was invisible. And that was your biggest mistake. Richard looked at the papers in his hands, then at me, and I saw the exact moment he understood. You've been planning this. From the beginning. Everything. All of it. You planned it all. Not from the beginning. I corrected. I didn't marry you planning to destroy your family. I loved you. Richard, I wanted this to work. But you and your mother made that impossible. So, yes. Once I realized what you all really were, I made a plan, and I executed it. You destroyed our family, Vicky said. And she was crying now. Ugly sobs that shook her whole body. No, I said firmly. You destroyed your family when you chose crime over honesty. When you chose cruelty over kindness. When you stood by and watched your mother tie me to a fence. I just made sure you couldn't hurt anyone else. Sarah lunged at me, but Richard caught her. Don't, he said. Just don't. I looked at all of them. These people who'd made my life miserable for 7 years. Who'd stolen years of my life and made me doubt my own worth. They were broken now, facing prison and bankruptcy and social exile. But I felt no triumph in their destruction. Just a profound sense of relief that it was over. Mommy Liam tugged on my hand. Can we go home now? Yeah. Baby, I said, squeezing his hand. Let's go home. I turned and walked away from the Vance estate for the last time. Behind me, I heard Vicky's wails, Sarah's accusations, Richard's defeated silence. Their family was imploding. Right there at Sarah's birthday party, in almost perfect symmetry to how they'd humiliated me a year earlier. But I didn't look back. I'd spent too many years looking back, trying to earn approval from people who would never give it. The months that followed were difficult but liberating. The divorce was finalized while Richard was awaiting trial. I got full custody of Liam and enough spousal support to go back to school. Richard was convicted of securities fraud and sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. Vicky pleaded guilty to embezzlement and got 8 years. Marcus, who'd fled to Mexico, was eventually extradited and lost his medical license permanently, along with getting 3 years for fraud. Sarah, who'd somehow remained ignorant of most of the illegal activities, lost everything but avoided prison. I heard she was working retail at a mall in the suburbs. Her Instagram dreams dead. I felt no satisfaction in their fates. Mostly I felt tired. The kind of bone-deep exhaustion that comes from carrying too much for too long. But underneath the exhaustion was something new, freedom. Real. Genuine freedom. I didn't have to ask permission to buy groceries. I didn't have to endure humiliation at family gatherings. I didn't have to pretend that abuse was love. I moved into a modest 2-bedroom apartment with Liam. It wasn't fancy, but it was ours. Every piece of furniture, every dish in the cupboard, was something I'd earned with my own work. I enrolled in night classes to finish my MBA, the degree I'd abandoned 7 years ago. This time, no one could tell me to quit. No one could convince me that my education didn't matter. Liam thrived away from the toxic environment of the Vance family. He made friends at his new school. He laughed more. He stopped having nightmares. Watching him heal made every difficult moment worth it. I'd freed us both from a prison of wealth and privilege that was really just a gilded cage. Some people called me vindictive when the full story came out. Others called me brave. Online forums debated whether I'd been justified in my actions. I didn't engage with any of it. I didn't need strangers to validate my choices. I'd lived through 7 years of abuse and come out the other side. That was enough. These days, I'm 3 semesters away from my MBA. I have a part-time job at a marketing firm. Entry level, but with room for growth. Liam is 8 now. Smart and funny and kind. We live simply, but we live honestly. Nobody controls us. Nobody makes us feel small. We're building a life on our own terms. Sometimes I think about that night, tied to the fence with ribbons, while wealthy people laughed at my humiliation. I think about how powerless I felt, how small they'd made me. But they underestimated me catastrophically. They saw a pretty face who'd gotten lucky marrying up. They didn't see someone who was watching, learning, documenting everything. The truth is, they destroyed themselves. They chose crime. They chose cruelty. They chose to build their empire on theft and fraud. I simply refused to go down with them. And I made sure their victims got some measure of justice. If that makes me vindictive, so be it. I'd rather be vindictive than be a victim. I don't regret what I did. Not for a second. Because now, when I look at my son, I can tell him honestly that his mother never let anyone make her feel worthless. I can teach him that sometimes walking away is the bravest choice, and sometimes standing up and fighting back is necessary. Most importantly, I can show him that you don't have to accept abuse just because someone has money or power or claims to be family. So here's what I learned from being tied to a fence at my sister-in-law's birthday party. Sometimes the people who should love you the most will hurt you the worst. Sometimes the family you marry into will try to break you. But you always have a choice. You can stay bound by their expectations and cruelty. Or you can cut yourself free. It won't be easy. It won't be pretty. But your freedom and dignity are worth fighting for. And sometimes, karma needs a little help from someone who's been paying very close attention. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever been in a situation where family treated you like you were worthless? What did you do about it? Would you have done what I did? Or would you have handled it differently? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, hit that like button and subscribe for more real stories about standing up for yourself. Your support helps me share these important stories. And who knows? Maybe your story could be next.